Nobody talks about this. Not really. We talk about depression as if it's a chemical equation. We talk about burnout as if it's a scheduling problem. We talk about anxiety as if the right breathing technique will dissolve it. But there's something underneath all of that. Something much quieter and far more unsettling, that almost nobody names directly. It's the moment when the soul doesn't break. It doesn't crash. It doesn't scream. It simply stops leaning forward. It stops reaching. And in that stillness, something that used to feel like aliveness begins to quietly exit the room. That's what I want to talk about today. Not the drama of suffering, the silence of it. You know, I've sat with this question for a long time. What actually happens when a person gives up on life? Not in the clinical sense, not the crisis hotline conversation, though that matters enormously. I mean the subtler version, the version that looks completely functional from the outside. The person who still shows up to work, still answers messages, still laughs at the right moments in conversations. But somewhere along the way, something essential retreated. Something decided, without making a formal announcement, that it was no longer safe to want things, no longer worth it to hope, no longer wise to be fully present in a life that kept disappointing them. Have you ever noticed how a plant does this? When the conditions aren't right, when there's not enough light, not enough water, when the soil has been depleted, the plant doesn't die dramatically. It simply stops growing upward. It redirects whatever energy it has left into pure survival. No new leaves, no reaching toward the window. Just the bare minimum required to technically remain alive. I think human beings do something remarkably similar. And I think most of us, if we're honest, have experienced at least a season of this. A period where we were technically alive, but not really inhabiting our lives. Where we were present in body, but the soul had quietly excused itself. Now see, the interesting thing, the thing that most conversations about this completely miss, is that the soul doesn't give up on life because life is objectively too hard. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because our first instinct is to look for the cause out there, to say, the relationship ended, the career collapsed, the health declined, the world became too much. And yes, those things are real, and they hurt, and they matter. But I've met people who have walked through absolute devastation and remained luminously alive. And I've met people living what looks like a beautiful life from every external angle who have somehow gone hollow inside. So the circumstances alone don't explain it. What I've come to see is that the soul gives up not on life itself, but on the version of life it was performing. And here's where it gets interesting. Most of us, without realizing it, have been living life as a kind of audition. We're always auditioning for something, for approval, for love, for significance, for safety, for the sense that we finally got it right. And this audition is exhausting. Not in a way you can fix with a vacation. Exhausting in the way that only the deepest kind of inauthenticity exhausts you. When you are perpetually performing a version of yourself that doesn't quite fit, the soul eventually registers this as an emergency, and it withdraws, not to punish you, but because it literally cannot sustain the performance any longer. This is, I think, one of the most misunderstood forms of suffering. We call it apathy. We call it depression. We call it emotional numbness. But what if it's actually a kind of protective wisdom? What if the soul, in its withdrawal, is saying something true? What if the giving up is not a failure, but a refusal? A refusal to keep pouring energy into a life that has been built on premises that were never really yours? Let me tell you about something I noticed in myself once. There was a period. I won't call it my darkest time because that's not quite right. But a period where I woke up every morning with this peculiar flatness, like the color had been turned down. Not off, just muted. And I did what most people do. I tried to troubleshoot it. I exercised more, slept better, read the right books, talked to the right people. And nothing changed. Because I was treating the symptom and completely ignoring what the symptom was trying to tell me. The flatness wasn't a malfunction. It was a message. It was my soul sitting down in the middle of the road and refusing to take another step in the direction I had been going. The moment I actually listened, not fixed, not solved, just listened, something shifted. Not dramatically, not like a sunrise, more like a fog thinning. I began to ask different questions. Not, how do I get motivated again? But, what am I actually doing this for? Not, how do I feel better? But, what is this feeling asking me to see? And what I saw was that I had constructed a life around avoiding a particular kind of pain, rather than moving toward anything I genuinely loved. And a life organized around avoidance is a life that the soul will eventually refuse to inhabit. Now, here's what I find philosophically remarkable about all of this. There's an old idea. You find it in Stoic philosophy. You find it threading through Buddhist thought. You find it in the writings of the Christian mystics. That suffering is not the opposite of a meaningful life. That, in fact, it is often suffering that strips away what is false and leaves behind what is real. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this. Viktor Frankl lived it in conditions that beggar the imagination. The Zen teachers talk about it in their odd, sideways way, and what they're all pointing at is something counterintuitive. The soul giving up on a particular life is sometimes the beginning of finding an actual one. But, and this is crucial, that only happens if you don't immediately rush into paper over the silence. This is what our culture is catastrophically bad at. We are terrified of the void. The moment emptiness appears, we fill it. With noise, with busyness, with substances, with screens, with relationships, with any stimulation that creates the sensation of aliveness without requiring us to actually be alive. And I understand the impulse. The void is uncomfortable. The void asks things of you. It asks you to sit in a not knowing that our minds find genuinely threatening. But think about it this way. When you drain a pond, you get to see what's been living on the bottom. And often it's things you lost long ago. Old desires, buried longings. A version of yourself that you quietly abandoned somewhere along the way because it seemed impractical, or dangerous, or too much to hope for. The soul giving up, if you let it complete its withdrawal rather than frantically calling it back, can reveal something astonishing. It can show you what you actually want, not what you've been told to want, not what would make other people comfortable, what you, in the deepest and least performing layer of yourself, actually want. You see, there's a distinction that I think matters enormously here. The difference between a life that is chosen and a life that is inherited. Most of us are living, to a greater or lesser degree, lives that were assembled for us. By our families, by our culture, by our particular historical moment, by the accumulated fears and ambitions of people who came before us. And we absorbed those templates so early, so thoroughly, that they feel like our own choices. We don't experience them as inheritance. We experience them as reality. When the soul gives up on life, sometimes what it's giving up on is precisely this inherited reality. It's saying, I cannot continue pretending that this template was built for me. I cannot keep performing this particular human being. Not because life itself is too much. Because this version of life, the one I've been living as if it were mine, was never quite true. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not romanticizing suffering. I'm not saying that every episode of depression is secretly a spiritual awakening in disguise. That would be both philosophically sloppy and practically cruel. Sometimes the soul gives up because it has been genuinely broken by things that should never have happened. Sometimes the withdrawal is a wound, not a wisdom, and wounds need tending. Real, patient, often professional tending. I hold that alongside everything else I'm saying. But even in the wounding, there is something that is trying to survive. Something that refuses to fully extinguish even when everything else has gone dark. I've found that one of the most remarkable things about human beings is this persistent, sometimes irrational, almost embarrassing quality of continuing to care. Even when they say they've given up, even when all the external evidence suggests complete withdrawal, there's usually some tiny flame still insisting on itself, and I think that flame is worth understanding. Worth protecting. Worth asking, what would actually feed you? Because the alternative, the complete and permanent giving up, is not what I'm describing. What I'm describing is the giving up of a false life. And there's a world of difference between those two things. One is an ending. The other is, paradoxically, a beginning. The most painful kind of beginning, certainly. The kind that doesn't feel like a beginning at all, but a beginning nonetheless. There's a metaphor that I keep returning to. Imagine a river that has been dammed, not by choice but by accumulation. Years of debris, silt, the wreckage of floods, things that just piled up over time until the water couldn't flow freely anymore. The river doesn't stop being a river. The water doesn't stop wanting to move. But the expression of that movement has been so constrained, so blocked, that from the outside the river looks like a swamp. It looks stagnant. It looks like it has given up. But if you remove the dam, and this is often a violent, disorienting process, the river doesn't politely resume its previous course. It carves new channels. It goes places it hasn't gone before. It discovers its own direction with a force and specificity that surprises even the landscape it's moving through. I think this is what happens when a person stops fighting the withdrawal and starts listening to it. When they stop trying to rebuild the performance and start asking what they actually want to express. The soul that gave up on one life is not incapable of life. It is capable of a different kind, a less curated, less performing, more genuinely inhabited kind. And accessing that requires a tolerance for the in-between, for the time when the dam has been removed but the new channels haven't yet formed, for the period when you genuinely don't know what comes next and your mind is screaming at you to just pick something, anything, to fill the uncertainty. Most people cannot tolerate this, and so they rebuild the dam. They go back to the life that was making them hollow, because at least it's familiar. At least they know how to perform it. And I have infinite compassion for this, because the in-between is genuinely terrifying. But I also know, and I say this with a kind of quiet certainty that comes from watching this process many times, that the rebuilding of the dam is always temporary. The soul will try again. It will withdraw again. It will create another crisis, another flatness, another silent refusal to continue. Because the desire to be genuinely alive is not something you can permanently override. You can delay it. You can suppress it for a long time, but it doesn't stop wanting. And so perhaps the most important question you can ask yourself, not when you're in crisis, but right now, in this ordinary moment, is this: am I leaning into my life, or am I managing it? Am I present in my own existence, or am I administering it from a safe distance? Because the administration of life is a form of giving up that doesn't announce itself as such. It looks like responsibility. It looks like maturity. It looks like being realistic. But underneath it, if you're honest, you might find that something essential stopped believing it was allowed to want things. Stopped believing the wanting was safe. And if you find that, I'd ask you to sit with it, rather than immediately solving it. Not because suffering is noble, but because understanding requires a kind of stillness that fixing cannot offer. Sit with the question: what did I stop reaching for, and when? What was the moment, or the accumulation of moments, when reaching started to feel too dangerous? What would I want if I believed that wanting was allowed? You don't have to answer those questions today. You might not answer them for a long time. The soul doesn't heal on a schedule, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But asking the questions, genuinely asking, not rhetorically, not as a self-improvement exercise, but with actual curiosity about your own interior. That asking is itself a form of reaching. And reaching, even slightly, even tentatively, is the opposite of giving up. This is what I believe, for whatever it's worth. The soul that has given up on a life is not a dead soul. It is a soul in the process of refusing the false and searching, however blindly, for the true. That process is painful. It is disorienting. It often looks like failure from the outside, and sometimes from the inside too. But it is not the end of the story. It is, if you're willing to stay present with it rather than running, often the most important chapter of the story. The chapter where you find out what you're actually made of, what you actually care about, who you actually are when the performance finally falls away. And that, I think, is worth knowing, no matter how uncomfortable the discovering. If something in this conversation landed for you, if it named something you've been feeling but haven't had words for, I'd genuinely love to read that in the comments. Not because I have the answers, but because these conversations matter most when they become actual conversations. And if you want to keep exploring these ideas together, subscribing to the channel is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. I'll be here, asking the questions that I think are worth asking,